minute and explain that this official notice with these facts, and these are just the sections of 19, they have really nothing to do with the process that you have in the department, except for the fact that they show these facts that go into it. Maybe it's better. Let me ask it differently. The 3 original violations that were separated were what was investigated at the department level.
That's correct.
And those were the reasons for terminating him.
That's correct. 2
of those happen to be rules and department regulations. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And one of them, which Scott and I have gotten all this argument about, is this broader concept of abusive or improper treatment of a prisoner that has nothing to do with your rules or regulations. Is that correct?
That's correct. It's a separate city policy. It's the policy of the city as opposed to a departmental rule or regulation.
So it's broader up here.
Yes.
And there's all kinds of things that could fit underneath that. Is that right?
That's correct. My understanding is that the ordinance provides that the city manager can provide rules and regulations that govern all employees in the city. And so that umbrella covers all employees in the city.
And this is actually an ordinance provided by council.
That's correct.
So the city manager's rules could be underneath there. Your department rules could be underneath there, which are underneath the city manager's rules. It's kind of like a trumping, right? But let's think of it this way. Is it true that you have the charter, then you have the ordinances, then you have city manager rules, and then you have department rules and regulations? Is that the order that goes in?
That's my understanding of the model. Yes.
And anything that conflicts up is void?
I would say that's correct.
But both these bureaucratic processes have to work together.
They do.
And obviously it's caused a lot of confusion here today.
It seems so, yes.
So the facts that you listed here, in combination with the things that allegations you sustained, these were the reasons that you terminated him in combination with your review of his file and his discipline that he's already received.
That's correct.
Okay. Was one of the reasons that you terminated Sanders because Sanders shoved a person so violently that he left his feet and flew backwards and hit his head against a wall in the cell wall?
Yes.
Did you believe that that was a proper treatment of a prisoner?
No.
Did you believe it was an abusive treatment?
Yes.
Is it correct that you found that the prisoner displayed no resistance to Sanders or anyone else when Sanders was launched against the wall?
When Mr. Baker was launched against
Mr.
the wall?
Baker, yes.
Yes, that is true.
And was Mr. Baker blinded by mace at that point, to your view?
He was blinded by mace and locked in a cell.
Have you ever been under the effects of pepper spray?
Yes, I have.
Can you tell me about that?
It hurts.
How much did it hurt?
It is one of the most miserable things I've ever had to do. I wear contact lenses, or wore contact lenses at the time, and I didn't wear contact lenses for 2 days. It's bad. Your lungs, you can't feel like you're getting any air. When you do breathe, it hurts. Your eyes, you can't even open when they're exposed to air, they burn. So it's a very disabling substance.
But isn't your reaction to want to close your eyes because it hurts?
You have to. You can't open them. My experience was when I opened them to be exposed to air, that it hurt even worse.
And even when you can open your eyes, can you see very well?
No.
Was it your belief that the prisoner was trying to seek assistance?
Yeah, he wanted water.
When you watched the video, did they take the toilet paper out of the room?
I don't recall that. I recall a paper towel. I don't remember anything about toilet paper, to tell you the truth.
Did you see any reason in the video why they would want to take the toilet paper out of the room?
No.
Do you know any reason why you would take toilet paper out of the room?
Yes. Occasionally, prisoners who wanted to be unruly or whatever would take the toilet paper and shove it down in the toilet and then start a flood in the room.
Did you see anything that would seem to show that Baker was going to do that?
No.
Wouldn't it be useful for Baker to be able to blow his nose with toilet paper?
I assume it would. He'd already used his shirt a little earlier, so he was willing to do that.
Is the mucus coming out of your nose? Is it burning? If it gets you.
I don't recall it burning so much there. My eyes were the biggest. I'm assuming you're talking about my discomfort from OC. It was my eyes. Do you have a lot of mucus and things coming out of your nose, and it causes a lot of water coming out of your eyes? But I don't remember my nose burning that badly.
So your main focus was on the water, that he was not receiving water. Is that correct?
Right.
And what do you think he could have done?
He being?
The Sanders.
Well, I'd have given him water.
Brought him a glass of water.
Glass of water. Ignored it.
Did Sanders do everything right at the beginning when he was helping him?
I felt like he did.
Could he move him to a different cell? Like working water?
He could have moved to a different cell.
Could they have asked somebody to keep looking for more decontamination while he's somewhere else in storage?
There were a myriad of things they could have done.
Would you agree the prisoner was really upset?
I think he was in pain, and I think he was frustrated with not being able to get water. I think he saw a source of water on the wall, and when it didn't work, he started questioning the officers, and I think he even said the city needs to pay their water bill, and I probably would have felt the same way.
And he was cursing a lot.
He was, absolutely. And I think I would have cursed too if I'd been told to get water from my face out of the toilet.
And that was an addition. Who told him to get water out of the toilet?
Former Officer Sanders.
Do you know anything about verbal judo?
I do.
What is the purpose of verbal judo?
The purpose of it is to give you another mechanism to de-escalate situations. But I've also seen officers use it to escalate situations. It can be used either way.
Obviously, you can use water from the toilet. Do you think that's an escalator?
You know, my feeling about that was a human being we're talking to, and telling someone to get water from the toilet would have made me angry as well. So I didn't think that was appropriate. I thought it was an escalating comment rather than one that was meant to de-escalate.
It was correct that you stated that the subject was showing no aggression to Sanders or anyone else when Sanders basically brutalized the subject.
I remember Mr. Baker in the video standing facing the door with his head down. Actually, he appeared to be imploring somebody to listen to him. He was making this motion with his hands when he was hit.
And in your view from the video, was the prisoner just standing there blind, upset, yelling for assistance, trying to get this pain to stop?
I believe that's exactly what he was doing.
In fact, did you state that the Sanders force was retaliatory?
I believed it was because and I looked at the totality of the circumstances, and I looked at the comments made by officers and things like that. And one of the things that made me believe it was retaliatory was after the fact, Officer Sanders could be heard over saying to the other two officers, well, I guess he lost round two. And when you add everything together, it's almost like we were looking for an opportunity to put him on the wall.
And so, did you believe that round one was this first fight at the other scene?
That's correct.
If the force that was used was retaliatory, would that be improper treatment of prisoners?
That would be unlawful treatment.
If the force that was used was retaliatory and not reasonable force, that would also violate his duty to use reasonable force.
That's correct.
You also stated that Sanders' use of force was unnecessary. Can you explain that?
Well, we had a prisoner in the form of Mr. Baker that was in a locked cell that was simply yelling and asking for water while beating on the door. And the options to me there were a bunch of them. I thought that he was just being loud, and it was irritating the officers. And so there was no real lawful objective, in my opinion, to go in and use use the force that was used.
Now, the locks that you've heard talk about that can be damaged, isn't that really a latch that's on the outside of the door?
I was told during this investigation that years ago, there's only 1 or 2 keys for the jail cells down there, and they get put in different drawers at different places down in the booking room, and officers couldn't find those keys. So when they would bring an unruly prisoner in, they needed a mechanism to lock the door temporarily. They could just get somebody in the cell and then get out and leave them in temporarily. So these metal latches were put on the outside of the door. They were never meant to secure the door permanently. You were supposed to take the key and lock it. And it was a typical jail cell door with a big jail key that was used to lock it. It's my understanding that all that they did here, why they were concerned because he was hitting the door, was because they did not use that key. They had only used the latch.
So they could have found the keys, latched it, undone the thing.
And
Even if Baker had an intent to damage the door, which we have no idea,
right.
it would have been okay.
Yeah, I think so.
Was the use of force unreasonable, gratuitous force?
I would describe it as such, yes.
We find the right exhibit. There's so many these days, and they're in such disheveled that it may take him. It's bigger than I thought. I'm looking at exhibit 22. And on page 3 of 6 of exhibit 22, there is a subsection 4, which is gratuitous force. Can I hand that to you, Chief?
Would you like to read it?
Yeah, please.
Gratuitous force, officers may not use any degree of force against a suspect once the suspect has been restrained, is no longer resisting, and is not a threat to the officer or others.
So, is the suspect restrained in a holding cell?
Yes, he is.
Is he resisting?
No.
Is he trying to escape?
No.
Is he a threat to officers or others?
No.
So by that definition, it was gratuitous force by what Sanders did.
Yes, I believe it was.
And that's never acceptable.
Never.
Did you also make the determination that Sanders' force was unreasonable?
I did.
Can you explain that?
Well, it was, it goes with being unnecessary. It was unreasonable because there was just absolutely no reason for it. The officers could just simply, if they were that afraid of him, should have just stayed outside the jail cell. He was in, they were out. That was the best option.
So the gratuitous one.
Exactly. So what, the options were obvious. If they feared him and they really believed that they really had to get into that jail cell, they had the option of calling for more officers. They had an option to call a SWAT team if they could. But you don't put yourself into a situation where you're likely to be hurt and then justify your force that you use by putting yourself in that position.
So to you, it was unreasonable that you had 3 officers but only used 1.
We had 3 officers and none of them had to go in there.
Okay, so
That's why it was unreasonable.
So backing up, it was just unreasonable,
In
period.
the first place.
Okay. Now, reasonableness depends on the facts and circumstances of a particular case. And the policy that you cited just talks about just reasonableness. And this other use of force policy talks about objective reasonableness. And that's a tort standard in federal court, is that right?
Yes, I think it's,
I think you had talked about it earlier, actually, with Krista, about what objective reasonableness was and how it's a Granby Connor standard, and talked about Chad Craig being an expert about it. I think
Hold
we'll
on.
address it.
I didn't talk about it in the context of a tort. It's a totally different ballgame.
I think that's true.
Are you aware of what objective reasonableness is often used for?
It's used in the court case, Graham versus Connor, that a lot of, in fact, I would say most American police agencies base their use of force reasonableness on. And it's called objective reasonableness, and it's based on a bunch of factors, not the least of which is the activities that the prisoner is engaging in, the size and the weight of the prisoner, what you know the prisoner has done in the past, the officer's size and strength, a bunch of factors. I'm not getting all of them, but it says that when you look at whether or not force is objectively reasonable, you have to evaluate these factors. And so when I looked at this case, there's no way the force could be objectively reasonable when the officers had a position of safety. They chose to give up their position of safety and go in and attack this violent person in order to chain him to the wall when they didn't have to. And that's what made it objectively unreasonable in my assessment.
Let's give them the benefit of the doubt and go through these, and you can just use your experience to tell us how you feel about these factors, because it's a factor test, right?
That's fair.
And it's a totality of the circumstances. You weigh all the factors, is that right?
That's correct.
First factor is, and actually these are, 3.3, is that where the factors start with the bullet points there?
Yes.
So if you look at 3.3 with the bullet points, as we go through them, you can look at them in these bits. So the first factor was, did the prisoner pose an immediate threat to the safety of officers or others?
He did not.
So that would weigh against the force being reasonable, right?
That's correct.
Was the prisoner actively resisting arrest or attempting to evade arrest by flight?
No.
So that would go against it being reasonable.
Correct.
What was the severity of the prisoner's crime?
My understanding, it was fair to pay child support.
So you would consider that that factor would go against it as well.
That's correct.
What were the number of officers involved to the single prisoner?
You had one suspect and you had 3 officers.
So that would go to the fact they'd be unreasonable too, is that right?
That's correct.
What were the condition of the officers and the prisoner, to your knowledge?
The officers, I think you see Mr. Sanders is a pretty stout build there. The other 2 officers were in pretty decent physical shape as well. The suspect obviously was semi-blinded at least, and in a position of just asking for help.
Wasn't the suspect also intoxicated?
Yeah, extremely, from what I understand. I think PAC was a .20 or something like that.
And the suspect had also had this battle in round 1.
That's correct.
It was exhausting to all these other officers, at least 2 of them that were fighting with him at that point.
I'm certain they were exhausted, and he was as well.
And you don't excuse that conduct, is fighting the other officers at all.
Absolutely not.
And you didn't find that they had done anything wrong in round 1.
And Mr. Baker got exactly what had to happen in the house.
What was the prisoner's mental state? That's the next factor.
It's difficult for me to assess, but based on what I saw in the video, he wanted water. That's all I can tell you. He was drunk. He'd just been in a fight with some cops. He was in pain, and he wanted some water.
So he's drunk, he's in pain, he's under the effects of mace, excuse me. So you wouldn't find that that would be favorable. It would be unreasonable as well.
That's correct.
What was the duration of the action? That's the next one.
There was no duration of action. He's in a locked cell. What this is referring to is in a fight with officers and suspects, how long has this been going on? And by way of example, if 2 officers, and I actually had 2 Columbia officers when I first came here, that were in a very, very violent fight with a suspect that they were starting to lose. They'd been fighting for a couple of minutes. One of the officers chose to use a lateral vascular neck restraint, which is a chokehold, which is forbidden by policy. Those officers came into my office expecting to be disciplined. When they explained to me the violence of the fight and the duration of the contact, they were justified in using deadly force, in my opinion, to stop that fight. And as a result, all 3 people were safe. Nobody died. The worst part of it was somebody got choked out. But that's what they're talking about when they're talking about the duration of the action. It's how long have you been fighting? and things are starting to escalate to the point where if you feel like you're going to lose the fight, you can escalate the force.
But the duration of this action was boom!
Actually, there was no action because we weren't in the cell. There was nothing, until we went in there, there was no duration of any action except on the part of Officer Sanders.
What was the availability of the prisoner to an item that could be used as a weapon in the holding cell?
He had obviously been searched because he'd been placed under arrest, so that threat was minimal if the officers did a proper search, and I assume that they did.
But the officers, I think, do you remember in the video that the officers had their guns on still?
I don't recall that in the video.
Okay.
Had I seen that in the video, that would have been another issue for discipline.
Because they're not supposed to do that.
They're not supposed to do that.
And if they hadn't brought any weapons into the holding cell, that there wouldn't have been any weapons in it. So that would be also one of the things. What was the prisoner's history of violence or weapon use?
I have no idea. To my knowledge, there wasn't any. There may have been. I didn't know his history.
Now,
The day that night, I don't think.
I think the argument would be is at least there was a history of violence in round one. So could that at least weigh the other way?
Oh, sure. Yeah. If you want to use what happened tonight, yeah.
And I'm not sure that that's relevant, but you could at least argue it.
Yeah.
But that's the only factor so far that is weighed that the force was reasonable. If you want to argue.
In my opinion, yes.
What about innocent bystanders that were present in the holding cell? Hopefully there were none.
There were.
Weren't. So that also weighed against it. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Is it reasonably likely that if you shove a prisoner who is intoxicated and at least partially blind hard enough to lift them from their feet, that they could get hurt and need medical attention?
Yes.
Did the prisoner appear to you to be in a position of power, ready to resist?
No.
Did it appear to you that the prisoner did not anticipate or react defensively at all?
He didn't have a chance.
Is it correct that you think he got launched into the wall because he had no idea what was coming?
I think that was partially the reason for his body doing what it was, is because he was in a semi-relaxed state. Anybody that was standing there ready to fight would not have flown through the air like that.
Because he's blind and he can't see and he's talking.
Correct.
And then was the prisoner restrained or partially restrained?
He was fully restrained in a locked jail cell.
So that factor also would go against it, wouldn't it?
Correct.
Were there any other relevant factors that you considered about what would have been reasonable in this case?
No.
So out of 14 relevant factors, considering the totality of the circumstances, you felt like 13 that the force was not reasonable, and it weighed against it being reasonable. Is that correct?
That's correct. And if you gave the one factor the benefit of the doubt, even it was a reach.
And that's because you felt like that had happened so far previously that they really weren't connected in it.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, at the risk of confusing things, the unreasonable use of force is also an improper treatment of a prisoner.
It is.
And it's also correct that the unreasonable use of force violated your lawful and reasonable policies of the department. Isn't that correct?
Yes, it did.
And those are two separate, distinct things that you could get fired over.
That's correct.
And you fired them for each one of those things. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
What facts supported a violation of a failure to give medical attention?
When Mr. Baker bounced off the wall and they realized after they'd examined him that he was bleeding on the floor of the jail cell, my expectation of Columbia police officers is that you treat people with basic human dignity. And that would be, I understand that they weren't trained in medical attention or anything, but I would have expected that somebody would have stayed with Mr. Baker to make sure that he maintained consciousness, at least pull him to a sitting position where there's not danger of him choking or whatever. He obviously has a head injury that we need to be concerned about, and nobody was.
So the main thing that upset you was that they had left him alone for 12 minutes after they initially checked him.
That's correct. They actually went outside to carry on a conversation.
Okay. And when they left him, wasn't he also cuffed to that ring?
He was cuffed behind his back to the ring, laying on his, I believe, his right side.
And I think one of the factors about that mace earlier was, if you remember, was that you're not supposed to be laterally, like, does it inhibit your breathing when you're cuffed like that?
Well, if you're talking about positional asphyxiation, that's a danger when somebody's injured. You know, we don't know how badly he's injured at this point. They're not doctors, so they should be doing everything they can to make sure that he has a clear breathing passage while they're waiting for the ambulance. You don't just leave somebody laying on the ground bleeding like that after a blow like that. I mean, Mr. Sanders himself even described it as a pretty brutal push. And so when we recognize we've hurt somebody, we need to make sure we stay there and we take responsibility. Those prisoners are our responsibility once we take them into custody.
Did you see Sanders make any attempt to provide any kind of basic first aid?
You know, I think before we get in a confusion about basic first aid, I'm talking about basic treating somebody like a human being.
Okay.
That's what I'm talking about. And that's what I'm getting someone we're assured that they're breathing, leaving somebody with them. He's completely restrained now. He's chained to the wall. He's chained to the floor. There should be no reason to fear him anymore. We should get him medical care, and we should make sure, can I get you a cup of water now while we're waiting for the ambulance? Basic human treatment.
So the medical attention you're talking about is making sure he's going to be okay. He's certainly not doing anything right now. And we want to make sure because we can't give the appropriate necessarily medical aid he may need. We want to make sure he's okay between the time that the incident happens and when the medics get there.
It's our absolute responsibility.
Okay. And was it correct that the failure to render medical aid violate your lawful and reasonable department policy?
Yes.
Do you believe that because Sanders used the force on the prisoner that he was the officer primarily responsible for giving this medical aid?
Yes.
Wasn't he also the most experienced officer on the scene?
Yes, he would have been the senior officer on the scene.
He had 18 years experience, is that right? Do you know that?
I believe that's correct.
And do you know that the other two officers only had 2.5 years of experience?
Yes, I knew they'd only been here a few years each.
What's the probationary period for an officer?
A year.
So not much beyond the probation.
Right.
Would you have fired Sanders separately and distinctly for all three allegations?
Yes.
And is that partially because of disciplinary record and your review of his file?
Yes. Yes, he had an extensive disciplinary history that I reviewed and have reviewed again since. And it's fairly clear that in this instance, termination is going to be the only thing that was an option.
There's been this accusation that you were going to fire him no matter what from day one. Didn't you wait to listen to his side of the story on that meeting day before you terminated?
I did, and I will tell you that the discussion that I had with the then Captain Bernhard, Lieutenant Shouse Jones, I think you were in the room.
Yeah, and I don't think we should talk about.
Well, I'm just telling you my recollection of it. I won't get into details, but I'm telling you what my visceral reaction is that we cannot tolerate one of our officers treating a citizen this way. And I was, as opposed to, I'm ready to fire him, I'm prepared to. And they said, in fact, I remember it being Captain Bernhard saying, let the investigation run its course. We may find something that actually justifies this. And I remember saying, I can't imagine what that would be, but okay. And we went forward with the investigation.
So you relented and the investigation went forward.
Absolutely.
It turned out that the investigation didn't convince you, is that correct?
That's correct.
And it didn't convince some of your command staff either, is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, you disagreed with all your command staff on the medical treatment part.
I did.
Okay. But ultimately, it was your decision after you listened to them, and you told them that day.
Yeah, I told them that day, and where they were coming from was that they weren't trained. And I told them this very same thing I just said to you. You know, this person is in our custody, so they are our responsibility. And you can characterize it like your own children, all right? You can't be with your children all the time, but they're your responsibility. And that's the way prisoners are in the custody of a police officer. So this man was in our custody. We just injured him. We owed him the basic care that we would give to, we'd give the same care to a dog who'd just been run over in the street. Why would we leave this human being laying there? And that's what I could never get my arms around. And the chain of command seemed hung up on, well, we don't train our officers to do first aid. I said, all I'm talking about is making sure the guy's breathing, making sure he's not going into convulsions, you know, staying there with him like we would somebody that we care about, because we should care about it. They're in our custody.
You felt like that was covered in that medical?
Absolutely is.
When you sent the letter inviting Sanders to come talk to you, there was a range of punishment listed, and it was 15 days determination. Is that right?
That's correct.
Sanders, when you talked to him, did he think he had done anything wrong or made any mistakes?
No.
Was he regretful or remorseful at all?
It was absolutely the opposite of what I thought I would have expected an officer in the same position, knowing that range of punishment. What I expected is somebody that would have come in and been remorseful and admit they made a mistake and say, this can be fixed, I'd like to save my job. There was none of that. He came in, I did nothing wrong, you're wrong, I did the right thing, and that's the end of it. So there was really no room for me to even consider anything else.
So basically, because he was completely unaccountable for his inappropriate actions, you felt like there was no choice at that point but to fire him.
Not only unaccountable, unapologetic, could not see where he was wrong.
And when you reviewed it, was that consistent with his prior disciplinary history?
Yes, I can't say every single one of them, but when I reviewed it, every single one was appealed that I remember, with the exception of just a few, and it was the same mantra. I didn't do anything wrong, it was somebody else's fault.
If Sanders had been accountable and come in and said, I did the wrong thing or I made a mistake, would you have considered a suspension?
We wouldn't be standing here right now. He'd be at work.
Is it correct that you made your decision only after meeting with Sanders, checking over his past service, his disciplinary history, and all the other relevant facts of the incident, including the recommendations of your chain of command, your staff, and IA?
That is correct. And I don't want to downplay it because I did say it, but I don't want to overplay it either. I was angry. I was embarrassed for our department. I knew what was going to happen when this became public, and we have a responsibility to our public. So it's going to be an embarrassment to the citizens of this city and to our department. And so I knew what was coming. I knew what was coming. So I was angry. I was angry for being put into that position. And I spoke out of anger that I'm prepared to terminate him right now. My cooler head prevailed, and we went through the investigation, and I remained objective. I think you talk to officers that I've had to discipline, they find me